Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Insightful Minds in International Macro Rising Star Seminar Series. Today is our second day of the Rising Star workshops, and we will have two speakers today. So our first speaker is George from Princeton University. He is quite very productive, so he has some other papers on the revision at the AER and Econometrica. Today, he's going to present his job market paper, Incomplete Information in Production Networks. Without further ado, I will let George start his talk.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ren, and thank you to the other organizers of this conference. I'm excited to be here and present my job market paper, which is on incomplete information production networks. And of course, feel free to ask questions at any point during the talk. So the motivation for this talk is that firms operate in supply chains, and these supply chains tend to be vulnerable to a wide range of shocks. So there's bankruptcies, transportation disruptions, natural disasters, and so on and so forth. There's been an enormous literature that argues that these microeconomic shocks, in the sense that they're disaggregated, so they affect just a single sector or a group of firms, can have widespread economic consequences. And basically, that's because they can travel through the economy's input-output linkages and affect the production decisions of other firms. So these microeconomic shocks can have large macroeconomic fluctuations. However, this work often assumes that firms, or a key assumption that underlies most of this work, is that firms possess perfect knowledge of this wide range of shocks when deciding on their input quantities. And for this reason, firms' input choices are contingent on, and they can perfectly respond to, this wide range of shocks that might be hitting the economy. Now, this assumption is critical in shaping how these microeconomic shocks have aggregate consequences, but it stands in contrast to a very large, both theoretical and empirical literature that argues that firms operate under incomplete information. So they don't have full or current information about economic conditions when making many production choices. Now, this uncertainty that incomplete information generates can be quite important, especially in production network settings, because it can distort how firms respond to shocks in terms of their input purchases, affect a firm's trading partners, and therefore have large implications for how these otherwise microeconomic disturbances aggregate to create macroeconomic fluctuations. Now, although incomplete information is arguably a quite important and relevant feature of firm production, it has been understudied, I think, in this production network context. So this motivates the following question, which is how do these microeconomic shocks aggregate to economy-wide disturbances when firms are imperfectly informed about macroeconomic conditions? Now, to answer this question, what I do in this paper is I take an otherwise canonical model of production networks in general equilibrium, one that has been extensively studied in the literature, and I change it in a single respect in that I assume that firms possess incomplete information about the realization of two fundamental types of shocks that drive the economy. So these will be sectoral productivity shocks, the productivity shock in each sector, and then a nominal aggregate household demand disturbance. The key assumption I'm going to make is that although firms can't observe these shocks directly, they can observe and condition their input purchases on the price of each input. So just like in the classical literature on rational expectations, like the Lucas Island model, if you're familiar with it, what firms will be doing in this context is they'll be hedging on whether a change in their input prices reflects supply disturbances due to changes in the productivity of other sectors or demand disturbances due to changes in aggregate household demand. Now, what I find here theoretically is that the macroeconomic impact of these sectoral shocks, productivity shocks, depends on the interaction between the network structure of the economy, as well as the uncertainty that firms face. And this is because of this hedging motive that I described earlier. In particular, incomplete information will change how responsive firms are to input prices in terms of their input quantities. Now, and this is because of this hedging behavior. Firms will want to infer how their costs co-vary with their revenues. It turns out that this change in responsiveness that happens at the microeconomic or firm level will have some pretty important consequences for how these sectoral shocks aggregate over the economy's production network. So just to tell you my main theoretical results in this context, what I find is that when there's a lot of productivity uncertainty relative to aggregate demand uncertainty, so you can think of this as lots of transportation disruptions or bankruptcies or other real shocks, then it's going to be shocks to upstream sectors that have a lot of either direct or indirect linkages to other sectors that have large effects on GDP. Conversely, it's times of high aggregate demand uncertainty in which downstream sectors that are closer to final good consumption, that will end up being more important in terms of the pass-through of these shocks to GDP. Now, the basic intuition for this result is the following. It's that in this production network setting with incomplete information, the pass-through or the aggregate impact of a sectoral shock compounds along the economy's input-output linkages according to the measure of firms' input responsiveness, how much firms adjust their inputs in response to changes in their costs. When there's a lot of productivity uncertainty in the economy, firms become very responsive to these changes. And for this reason, it's upstream sectors whose output travels through many linkages that function as important sources of risk. Conversely, it's downstream sectors that are more important when there's high aggregate demand uncertainty. And that's because firms become less responsive to changes in their input prices. Sure, their costs might be going up, but they think that all such changes are purely nominal. So they also forecast greater demand and revenues. Now, in the last part of the paper, I quantify the economic relevance of my results by calibrating the model to the US input-output structure, as well as the historical measures of uncertainty that firms have faced. And here, I find that the aggregate impact of these sectoral or microeconomic shocks systematically changes relative to the complete information benchmark in recessions. Why recessions? Because according to my estimation, these are times of particularly high aggregate demand volatility. So just to give you a number here, the aggregate effect of an aggregate productivity shock, so a shock that hits all sectors in the economy equally, is 50% lower during COVID relative to non-crisis times, which will be close to the complete information benchmark. And as you'll see, that's precisely because the kind of uncertainty that firms face will be quite different during these two periods. So our measures of network importance aren't immutable, even with a fixed network structure, which is the framework within I operate in, but they critically depend on firms' uncertainty. So that's sort of the overview of a paper. I hope it gave you an idea of what I'm trying to do, as well as a flavor of the results. Just to tell you briefly how this paper is linked to the broader literature, it's related to this large literature on networks and the macroeconomy. The prevailing assumption here is complete information, but there's also some recent papers that have made some really important steps in studying the interaction of these input-output linkages with uncertainty. Still, the prevailing assumption here tends to be that firms choose these intermediate inputs under complete information or under no uncertainty. Here, what I want to emphasize is how firms respond to changes in their costs under incomplete information can have some pretty important macroeconomic consequences. Now, because I assume that firms can observe their costs or they can condition their input purchases on prices, my paper also relates to a large literature in which firms learn from market outcomes. For example, the Grossman-Stiglitz model is one of these papers that shares this methodological tool, or the Lucas Island model. Of course, here, learning happens from firm-to-firm interactions in input markets without reference to these physically segmented islands, say hypothesized by Phelps in the 60s and 70s or Lucas. Now, this kind of information which firms learn from markets will also shape their expectations and will have some important effects for the business cycle. There's a lot of work that explores this. What I want to emphasize here is how these disaggregated shocks affect aggregate outcomes, while most of this work tends to focus on aggregate shocks. So let me just pause to see if there's any questions. Otherwise, I'll just go on to the model, the theory, and the quantification. Okay. So let me start. My model has two ingredients. It has linkages and information. So let me start with linkages, which really follow standard micro foundations. It's going to be essentially identical to a paper by Chimoglu, Carvalho, Takbas, Ozdaglar, and Takbas Alehi, if you're familiar with it. So time t is discrete and infinite. Sectors are indexed by n, and firms produce with Cobb-Douglas technology. So Q is the amount of sectoral output. C is just a normalizing constant, just makes the expressions a little simpler, but you can otherwise forget about it. Z is the sectoral productivity shock. L is the amount of labor they purchase. X is the amount of input sector N purchases from sector N prime at time t. These coefficients here in the Cobb-Douglas technology are what parameterize the input-output linkages between different firms. And these can be zero. It doesn't have to be that one firm purchases from every other firm in the economy. So these sectoral productivity shocks are going to follow the following process. So this AR1 process with potentially some time-varying volatility. It's these shocks over here that are going to generate uncertainty about these shocks and about these productivity shocks. And this delta term over here will parameterize the overall amount of uncertainty in the economy. This will become useful later on when I need to log linearize the economy around this coefficient. Firms' profits here are simple. It's their revenues minus their costs. One key object we need to define is the economy's input-output matrix. So what I'm just doing here is I'm just taking these coefficients, alpha, and I'm just stacking them into a matrix. So this will essentially tell us what the network structure of the economy is, this matrix.
So sorry, so you allowed the shock variance to change over time?
Yeah, so the covariances of the shock, the correlation of these shocks between different sectors is completely unrestricted.
Okay, then why? So what is the benefit of doing that, or what kind of features can be generated by this?
Yeah, I mean, I think my theoretical results are robust to any correlation structure across these shocks. So I didn't want to just put more structure than I had to. And also when I go to the quantification, I assume this is a completely flexible correlation structure. One assumption I will have to make, but I might discuss a little bit more detail in the quantification, is that the correlation across sectors is constant, doesn't vary across time. This is needed just to estimate the model. It makes it much easier to estimate the model via maximum likelihood. But for the theory, it's unrestricted.
Okay, thank you.
So before I describe the information, let me just close the model by describing households, which is where this aggregate demand shock is going to come from. So there's two traded assets in this economy. There's money, denoted by MT, and then there's short-term risk-free bonds, BT. So the way I'm going to model this aggregate demand shock follows standard assumptions. So I'm going to use what's called Golosov and Lucas preferences. This just means that households like goods, or this aggregate consumption bundle, which is a weighted average of the sectoral goods with coefficients gamma. These can also be zero. So a household doesn't have to be directly buying, say, credit or oil, I guess. It likes real money balances and has some disutility from labor. It has a budget constraint, so the amount of stuff it purchases must be equal to the stuff it has now, where bonds pay a nominal rate of IT minus 1, it's endogenous, wage payments, profits, and then the transfers from the government. Now, let me just describe this aggregate demand shock. This is going to come from variations in the money supply. It's simply a parsimonious way to capture changes in households' desire to spend money, and I'll show you this later on. What I mean by this is that the money supply follows a random walk with also some potentially time-varying volatility. It's these shocks over here that are going to generate fluctuations in households' aggregate demand, or essentially just the desire of how much nominal expenditure they'd like to do per period. So this is all some preferences that are quite standard to get some really nice and tractable forms. Finally, I assume that wages satisfy the following rule. So they're sticky with a parameter given by chi, where WT star is the frictionless wage rate in this economy. So when chi is equal to 0, we're just back to the case where wages aren't sticky at all. This will be important because it parameterizes how the pass-through of this aggregate demand shock affects real GDP. So chi is just any arbitrary number here. Okay, so now let me show you how I model information. So at the beginning of time t, I assume that these past productivity shocks and this aggregate demand shock is common knowledge. However, firms choose inputs under incomplete information about the contemporaneous realization of these shocks. So what this means is that they choose inputs to maximize the real risk-adjusted profits, conditional on a buyer input specific information set. So this is a fairly general formulation. I'll specify this in just one moment. This PT times CT is just a household stochastic discount factor. So these profits are risk adjusted. Now, the key assumption that I'm going to make in this paper is that although firms don't observe these shocks directly, they can condition their input purchases on the price of each input. So just in the same spirit as the Lucas Island model, for example, here, firms will be learning from their local transactions in input markets. While in the Lucas model, islands are a metaphor for these transactions, the relevant notion of an island here is the transaction that occurs between two different firms and markets. So a firm's choices are contingent on the price of that input that it's purchasing, but not on productivity, demand, or the prices of other inputs in the economy. Just to be a little bit more concrete here, and to tell you what this assumption represents, you can think of this as a firm that's composed of many different managers. Each manager is responsible for purchasing a single input. That manager goes to the market for that input and chooses how much of that input to buy based on that input's price and his beliefs about the economy, taking the demand schedules of these other managers as given. So these managers don't communicate. This is really what this assumption captures and how I model incomplete information in this framework. Now, finally, I assume that labor is an input that adjusts to realize demand. This is an assumption one needs to make to preserve market clearing in this context. So you can think of labor as something like overtime work, capacity utilization, or any other factor that adjusts to realize demand conditions. And this will be sufficient to ensure that you can operate within a Walrasian framework. And there's a question, I think, from Econ Dojo. Or maybe
yes. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So my guess is your information set is endogenous, right? Because it contains the input prices.
That's right. Yeah.
That's right. Okay. Why did you make the assumption that the past shocks like Z and M are observable? Is that just because you can? So when you make these assumptions, you can solve the model. I guess that this is effectively like doing a truncation.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's for tractability. You don't have to relax this assumption. You're exactly right that if I hadn't made this assumption, I think you would also get some rich predictions about dynamics. So how a contemporaneous shock now not only affects output today, but also affects output into the future. This would just complicate the problem a little bit. So here I just want to make a first step in analyzing this framework. I'm just assuming that all shocks are revealed after one period. But you're exactly right that you could relax this assumption.
Okay, so are you going to talk about how you solve the model later?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. There's an important procedure here to disentangle the fact that information is endogenous. That's actually the key methodological challenge that I faced in solving the equilibrium here. Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay, so I will just wait until you talk about that. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so an equilibrium here is fairly standard. It's just a rational expectations equilibrium. So households will maximize their utility and supply labor to meet demand. Firms will choose labor to maximize the realized profits, taking input prices, demand, and their productivity as given. So labor is chosen under no uncertainty by assumption here. And then firms will choose their intermediate inputs to maximize their expected profits given their available information. This is really the key distinction between this model and, say, the classic model of production networks in the literature in which firms choose inputs under no uncertainty. And finally, expectations are consistent with equilibrium laws of motion and markets clear, so we're operating within a rational expectations framework. Okay, So let's move on to the theory. Now, before I describe exactly how incomplete information affects the aggregate impact of the shocks, I just want to provide you with some very brief background on how these things operate under complete information. I think this is useful because it serves as a useful benchmark. So to do this, we just need the following lemma, and here you can see the convenience of these Kolosov-Lucas preferences, which tells us that this frictionless wage rate, as well as nominal expenditures, are proportional to the overall amount of money balances in the economy. So this is what Kolosov-Lucas preferences bias. If you just shift the money supply, then you just increase the amount that households want to spend. And this is just a parsimonious way to capture aggregate demands. Now, the other thing we need is the household's demand functions here. Recall that Cobb-Douglas tells us that these take a very simple form. The overall expenditures for households is a constant fraction of the revenues under complete information. So the complete information benchmark tells us that these shocks pass through to real GDP, the C over here in the following way. An aggregate demand shock passes through to real GDP equal to the overall amount of wage rigidities in the economy. When chi is equal to 0, we just recover monetary neutrality. So this is quite intuitive. Now, these sectoral productivity shocks pass through onto real GDP according to what is called that sector's DOMAR weights. DOMAR weights are just a fancy way to describe a sector's size or its revenue share of GDP. So there's a very, I think, stark way to see how shocks transmit onto real GDP under complete information. All you have to do is look at that sector's size or its revenue share of GDP, and you immediately know the aggregate impact of a shock. Now, of course, in this framework, there's two reasons why sectors can be big. They can be a sector that's really desired by households. It has a high gamma, so to speak, or it can be a sector that supplies to a lot of other sectors that are desired by households. This is captured by this power sum of these linkages A. So if it's a supplier to a sector, that's captured by the first round A. If it's a supplier to a supplier of a sector that's liked by households, this is captured by this matrix A squared, and so on and so forth. But essentially what this result is a network irrelevance result. It says that you don't have to really take into account the network structure of the economy. Just look at that sector's DOMAR weight. Now, how does incomplete information change stuff? Well, to do that, we need to look at the firm's demand functions. So they're qualitatively quite similar relative to the complete information case. Again, labor, expenditures on labor, a constant fraction of realized revenues. That's by assumption. This is this flexible input that adjusts to demand. But for these intermediate inputs, now firms choose so that their expenditures are, or on a risk-adjusted basis, are a constant fraction of expected revenues. And this really reveals that firms' optimal choice of inputs in the setting depends on how well firms can forecast their revenues. And in particular, there's a dual role of prices here. There's a canonical cost savings role captured through the denominator. If prices go up, then a firm just wants to reduce the amount of inputs that it purchases, just a classical cost savings channel. But if a firm also believes that its prices and revenues are positively correlated, then it might want to be less responsive to this price change. So this is exactly as in Lucas or say Grossman and Stiglitz. Now, let me just tell you in a very simple vertical supply chain what this information structure says. So you can think of this as sector ones. They make tires. They purchase labor to make tires. They sell this on to firms in sector 2 that make bikes, and then they sell this on to households. So sector 1 is the upstream sector, sector 2 is the downstream sector. In this economy, firm 2's revenues must be equal to total expenditures. And we know that total expenditures are simply proportional to the money supply. This is what this equation represents. Now, the key problem that's facing firms in sector 2 here is that they don't know demand perfectly when choosing their inputs. But one thing they observe is the price of that input that they're purchasing. So how much should that firm purchase from firms in sector 1? Well, there's two components to this choice. There's this cost channel and there's the signaling channel. Intuitively, if firms think that higher prices are also associated with greater demand, then a firm wants to purchase more. If the costs are higher, then a firm wants to purchase less. This is all that this framework is capturing. And finally, we can also show here that firm one's price is equal to its marginal cost. If the productivity is high, its price is low. If the wage is high, then its price is high. So these are really the two equations that characterize the equilibrium in this framework. Well, this is something we can solve for. And this is what I do in this slide. It tells us that the pass-through of this upstream shock to real GDP depends on the responsiveness of firms in sector 2 to changes in the prices of that input. So this elasticity. In particular, when this elasticity is high, when these downstream firms are very responsive, then upstream shocks pass through a lot to real GDP. Conversely, if these firms aren't very responsive to changes in prices, then it's really hard for that upstream shock to have any impact on real GDP. Well, this is also something that we can study in closed form, so we can just solve for this elasticity. It has the following expression. You'll note here that it depends on the relative volatility of upstream productivity shocks, sigma 1z, to aggregate demand volatility. And in particular, that this responsiveness is increasing in this ratio. And this is what I've plotted here. So the pass-through of productivity in this upstream sector, this tire sector, is increasing in the relative uncertainty that firms are facing about productivity relative to aggregate demand. What's going on here? Well, as firms believe that all changes in their costs are driven by supply disturbances, they forecast that demand is unchanged, so they become more responsive. As aggregate demand uncertainty increases relative to productivity, firms think all changes in their costs are nominal. So they become less responsive to changes in their costs, and therefore the pass-through of productivity to demand is also lower. So one key takeaway I want to emphasize here, which I show generalizes for broader network structures, is that the impact of a shock depends on firms' relative uncertainties about demand versus supply disturbances. The second thing I want to emphasize is that Domar weights are in a very good approximation of shocks, of the aggregate impact of shocks in this economy. Indeed, in this simple vertical supply chain, the Domar weight of each sector is equal to unity because they're the only sector that's supplying stuff to households. Nevertheless, the impact of an upstream shock can be far different from unity. In fact, it can even be negative if firms are negatively responsive to changes in their prices. So Domar weights can function as a very poor approximation in this setting. The third observation is that the impact of the shocks on aggregate output is really shaped by the interaction of uncertainty with network structure. Indeed, if you just look at the pass-through of the most downstream shock, so a shock to this bike economy now, then this will always pass through one-to-one to real GDP. So there seems to be a certain feature about how exactly uncertainty interacts with that sector's position in the network structure of the economy, if it's upstream or downstream. So this really leads me to my main theoretical results of the paper, which is show how that sector's position in the network structure of the economy interacts with the kind of uncertainty that firms face in shaping the transmission of these shocks. So let me just pause here again, just to see if these sort of three observations are sort of clear. And I'll show you that these generalize to broader network structures, but I think this is really sort of summarizes also to an extent the key takeaways of the paper.
I think the reason that the uncertainty may matter is because there is a signal extraction problem.
Yeah, that's
right. So if the variance is bigger, so it might be more difficult. I don't know. So maybe it's it will affect how the firms or the agents interpret the signals, the price, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's basically a signal extraction problem that firms are facing, or a confusion in the sense of Lucas that they're trying to disentangle supply from demands. That's what's going on here.
And I think at the beginning you said that what you care more is about the disaggregated shocks, right? But here, so the demand shock is the aggregate shock because it's modeled as the shock to the money supply, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is just a parsimonious way, and also a way that's quantitatively implementable in modeling aggregate demand, one could have also had disaggregated demand shocks through changes in household preferences. And the key
Right. So
features would remain the same there as well.
my question is, your focus is going to be on aggregate shocks or sectoral level shocks?
So the focus will be on these sectoral shocks, these
Or
sectoral productivity shocks.
Okay. Yeah.
But the model also has some implications for the pass of these aggregate demand shocks as well.
Okay, I see. I think Econ Dojo has another question.
Yes, Econ Dojo.
I'm kind of interested in how you solve the model. If you look at the solution that's highlighted in the box, it only depends on contemporaneous Z and M.
Yeah,
But
that's right.
I think it is well known that if you have endogenous signals in the information set, like what you have here, typically the solution doesn't really admit finite state representation. So because of some very complicated higher order beliefs going on here. So how did you deal with that? Potentially number of states.
Sure. So
the firms could be focusing the focus of others.
Of course. So, well, one thing I just want to say here in this particular supply chain that I showed you, the simple vertical supply chain structure, this is the unique solution to the problem. It just can be solved by hand because it's the unique solution to this system of equations. And that can be shown at least for this network structure. But you're right that for more general network structures, we might not have uniqueness, precisely because firms might be coordinating on these signals in a particular way. I haven't been able to prove uniqueness for general network structures, but I will show you, however, I think some useful comparative statics about how we should expect all equilibria to behave. And I'll also show you exactly how I implement this numerically in just a moment. Does that answer your question, or would you like me to shed light on some other features here?
Yeah, I think what makes this type of problem challenging to solve is the fact that in the presence of endogenous information, you have to solve like a dual fixed point problem, right? Because information is also changing over time.
Exactly.
That's what makes the problem really difficult.
It is. So, okay. So without further ado, let me answer your initial question. I think this might also help in clarifying methodologically what makes it difficult, and also this issue of non-uniqueness. So to do that, we'll have to look at general network structures. Now, as Econ Dojo exactly conjectured, for general network structures, this is complicated because firms need to forecast their customers' demand, which might depend on their customers' demand, and therefore the kind of uncertainty that firms face, and so on and so forth. Now, here we can't solve the equilibrium in closed form as we did for the simple network economy, but we can obtain an equilibrium characterization in terms of an implicit solution to a system of equations. Indeed, the key mathematical challenge is that this system of equations is essentially a system of functional equations. So let me just explain what that means. The first equation we have is obtained from market clearing. So it tells us that a firm's revenues must be equal to the sales to its customers and then the sales to its other firms, this last term. The second equation is simply a consistency equation. It tells us that what firms sell must be equal to what they produce. So all we've done here is just substituted for the firm's input demand functions into their production function. Now, the key challenge here is that these choices depend on the stochastic properties of endogenous objects, in particular, the stochastic properties of prices and revenues, endogenous market outcomes. Moreover, to just answer Econ Dojo's question in a little bit more detail, a firm's input demand functions here is what is going to shape the transmission of these microeconomic shocks to aggregate output, exactly as it did in the simple vertical supply chain economy. Of course, how firms respond to changes in their prices is what's going to shape fluctuations in revenues and prices. but that's exactly what determines the optimal input responsiveness to begin with. So there's a fixed point here we need to solve between input responsiveness and fluctuations. And that's really the key methodological challenge, that what shapes firms' demand functions is depends on these endogenous objects. We need to solve essentially for this function, and this is why this is a system of functional equations. So to do that, and this is sort of the algorithm that it also implements quantitatively, we need to use a two-step procedure. So what I'm going to do here is I'm first going to fix firms' input demand functions, and then I'm going to solve for the optimal demand function given the fluctuations in revenues and prices that these demand functions implement. So this two-step procedure will allow us to decompose this fixed point that I explained in the previous slide. Now, to do that, we will need to make one simplifying assumption. We'll need to log linearize the market clearing equation around small amounts of uncertainty. So as this delta goes to zero, this will at least transform the system, which is a nonlinear system of functional equations, to a linear system of functional equations. We need two objects here. So we need the firm's revenue share matrix. So this is the sales to n prime as a fraction of n's revenues. And the key object of this analysis, the firm's input responsiveness matrix. So what I'm doing here, I'm just taking these input demand elasticities, the stuff I showed you before, and I'm just stacking them into a matrix. And this leads me to the main theoretical result of this paper, the first main theoretical result, which is to show how the first order impact of shocks on real GDP depends on firms' input responsiveness and its interaction with the network economy. So in particular, the aggregate impact of these microeconomic shocks depends on this index here, which I call the economy's augmented by uncertainty DOMAR index, or AUDI, to refer, since we're talking about networks, it needs to be something that talks to cars. So this AUDI depends on the network structure of the economy, this A object, as well as this input responsiveness term. And this dot here is the Hadamard or element-wise product of these two objects. Now, this is a bit of a mysterious object, but the key takeaway that I want you to see here is that it really depends on both network structure and input responsiveness. I'll show you what this means economically in just 1 second. Moreover, as this index increases in the element-wise sense, then the pass-through of these shocks to real GDP also increases. And there's a similar propagation mechanism for demand, but let me just skip this in the interest of time. Okay, now what is this index? What is AUDI? It has a simple economic interpretation, I think, that's actually linked to an extensively studied topic in the social network literature called alpha centrality. And to see this, let's suppose that all firms have a common level of input responsiveness. So this omega t star is constant. All firms respond to changes in their costs in the same way. I'll show you that this obtains under some conditions later on. In this case, you can write this index as the sort of present discounted value of the economy's input-output linkages. So in particular, the importance of a sector here in terms of how a shock transmits to real GDP is given by all you have to do is count that sector's linkages to its customers, given by this matrix A, and then you weight them by this measure of input responsiveness. You then take the linkages of that sector's customers, its higher order linkages, given by this matrix A squared, and then you weight them by these input-output weights squared, and so on and so forth. So what AUDI is it's really a measure of how central that sector is in the network structure of the economy, where its higher order linkages are weighted by firms' input responsiveness. So this thing that we fixed to begin with. Now, what one can show here is that these AUDI weights are also element-wise increasing in input responsiveness, which means that as firms' input responsiveness increases, firms that have more and more of these higher order linkages, so the connections of their customers, and so on and so forth, will become increasingly more important in how their shock passes through onto real GDP. So just going back to the simple vertical supply chain economy, if firms in sector 2 have a unitary elasticity in terms of how respond to firms in sector 1, then the AUDI weight of that economy is equal to 1. If they're not responsive at all to changes in their costs, then shocks in the upstream sector have no effect on real GDP. In general, the AUDI weight of sector 1 is simply is simply given by the input responsiveness of firms in sector 2. We can look at a more complicated structure, an oil network. So now we're adding this sector that supplies to every other sector in the economy. In this case, the Audi of this oil economy, so the impact of an oil shock onto real GDP or consumption, not only depends on its direct linkages, given by this 1 over here, or the input responsiveness of sector 2, this omega 2, but also how responsive firms are in sector 2 to changes in the price of sector 1. So it's higher order linkages, this bold term over here. So when firms become more responsive, oil becomes more important for 2 reasons. First, because firms in sector 2 directly become more responsive to changes in the price of oil, but also because firms in sector 2 become more responsive to changes in the price of sector 1's inputs. So far, and this brings me to the next step of the algorithm, so far we've taken input responsiveness as exogenous, and now we're going to endogenize it. To do that, we just need to find this uncertainty ratio of productivity to demand. So as this is 1 for each sector, as volatility for productivity increases relative to demand, this uncertainty ratio also increases. The main theorem here is that as demand uncertainty increases, so as these uncertainty ratios go to 0, then firms' responsiveness decreases, and indeed firms can become negatively responsive to changes in their input prices in a way that's determined by the overall amount of wage rigidities. And moreover, it's only in this case that the pass-through of demand to real GDP is equal to the complete information benchmark. As demand increases, firms become less responsive. Why? Because they think that all changes in their costs are nominal. Conversely, as productivity uncertainty increases, then firms become more responsive to changes in their input prices. And it's only in this case that the pass-through of the shocks to real GDP converges back to the complete information benchmark. So it's times of high aggregate demand uncertainty relative to productivity uncertainty that we can get far different measures of sectoral importance relative to what the complete information benchmark implies. So now we've closed this loop, and I've showed you how these comparative statics act with respect to the exogenous shocks that drive the economy. Just to show you what this means in terms of this oil economy, suppose there's a lot of supply shocks to oil, so this sector that supplies to every other firm. Then in this case, the aggregate impact of sectoral shocks is equal to the complete information benchmark. Why? Well, that's because firms think that all changes in their input prices are reflected by supply disturbances, changes in the price of oil. What happens if there's lots of aggregate demand uncertainty? Well, then it's only direct linkages to households that matter, because firms think that all changes in their input prices are nominal. So they don't really respond to these prices. The sectoral importance of a sector is now only determined by these direct links to households. So the relative importance of oil decreases relative to this case of high productivity uncertainty. More generally, there's, I think, a rich interaction here between uncertainty and the network structure, because if there's lots of shocks to say, a distant sector in the economy, sector 1, then the pass-through of oil shocks to consumption also increases through its impact on these higher order linkages. So to study generally how uncertainty interacts with the network structure in a realistic setting, one will need a quantitative implementation. So this is what I do in the last part of the paper. My goal is here to quantify the model's implications for the effect of these shocks on output. And there's 2 things I need here: input-output structure and proxies for uncertainty. Getting at the input-output structure is pretty easy using standard techniques. What I'm going to do to get at these proxies for uncertainty is I'm going to measure sectoral productivity at a disaggregated level using BLS data. And I'm also going to back out this latent aggregate demand shock through changes in nominal GDP. Recall that this is a sufficient statistic that tells us how aggregate demand moves over time. One thing we need to do is just set this wage rigidity term to a number that matches the covariance of nominal wages to log GDP. And finally, because this BLS data is at an annual frequency, I'm also going to assume that variances are evenly distributed across quarters. Now, the way I estimate these variances is through a GARCH framework. Essentially, what this says is that I find that there's high uncertainty for a particular shock when there is a large shock to begin with in the last period, or if it's followed by also a time of high aggregate demand uncertainty. And this is just a parsimonious way to capture the broad trends in uncertainty that firms are facing over different kinds of shocks. So now to answer Kondraljo's question more fully, the way I solve this model is using the two-step procedure that I outlined above, in the sense that I first guess what firm's input responsiveness is, and then I make sure that it's consistent with the model implied laws of motion for firms' beliefs about how prices and revenues co-vary. And I do this via the Newton-Raphson method. I need to solve for demand functions for each sector. Each sector implements a demand schedule for each input. I have 66 sectors, so there's about 4,300 variables I need to solve for, 66 squared. Okay, so my calibrated measure of uncertainty here is given by this following graph. It tells us that uncertainty about productivity, this blue line, and uncertainty about aggregate demand, this red line, tends to spike in recessions. I think this is a well-documented fact in the literature on uncertainty, that uncertainty spikes in recessions. What's going to be important in this framework is changes in relative uncertainty as opposed to absolute uncertainty, because this is what's going to affect firms' optimal level of input responsiveness. Now, what this...
I have a question.
Yeah. Yes,
So
please.
I think that relative volatility matters argument, is that based on your model only have information frictions? So for example, if I also have a nominal rigidity, whether these results still hold, I have a little bit of doubt in this, right?
No, you're exactly right. So there's one nominal rigidity here, which is these wages, and they're set to be constants. Of course, potentially this could also vary with the cycle.
Right,
There
because
might be...
your model, if you get rid of this information friction, then basically my understanding is that this MT does not have real effects, right?
Well, if there's wage rigidities, then it would have real effects, even without information frictions. If there's no nominal rigidities nor incomplete information, then this MT has no real effects exactly, as you conjectured. Yeah.
Right. And another question is, so I'm saying now you are quantifying the role of the information, incomplete information, but that also relies on the assumption of the model itself, right? Because if you change some of the assumptions, then the role might be different, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you change the informational structure to something different, then of course the pass-through of these shocks to real GDP is also going to be different. One
Right.
thing
And
yeah.
yeah, another question, it could be quite a naive question. So like when you infer the shock from this price signal, so that my question is so obviously the firms cannot distinguish between the demand shock and the sectoral the productivity shock, but can they distinguish between the productivity shock to their own sector and then the productivity shock for another sector?
Yeah, so in my baseline calibration, I assume that they can't. The only thing they observe is input prices. It's not particularly sensitive to this assumption, because as I'll show you, there's a very well-defined flow of goods and services, at least in the US economy, in the sense that output tends to travel from upstream sectors to downstream sectors. And for this reason, there's even if firms know their productivity, that won't be captured in changes in their input prices, because these economies don't tend to feature loops in the sense. Of course, as one increases the level of aggregation, they feature more and more loops. But in general, it's really just upstream sectors that provide goods, and then they pass through those goods to downstream sectors. For example, in the vertical supply chain, the pass-through of these shocks it doesn't depend on whether these downstream sectors knew their productivity or not. In that simple example that I showed you.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Simply because it's not reflected in their input price.
Right.
Okay, so let me just show you what this time variation uncertainty implies. It implies a lot of state dependence in the pass-through of aggregate shocks. So I think this is a useful benchmark just to see how an aggregate shock passes through onto consumption. In particular, during non-crisis times, the pass of these aggregate productivity shocks to consumption is well approximated by complete information. Why? That's because what swamps firms' uncertainty in normal times, under my estimation, is sectoral productivity shocks. It's important that the estimation here takes sectoral productivity uncertainty into account, as opposed to aggregate productivity uncertainty, because otherwise you don't find this result. In simple terms, what this says is that when we're not in times of crisis, what really moves firms' decisions is how productive their suppliers are. Conversely, during recessions, what matters relatively more for firms is aggregate demand. And that's because, according to my estimation, say during the financial crisis or during COVID, aggregate demand volatility increased by relatively more compared to sectoral productivity uncertainty. Because of this, the pass-through of an aggregate productivity shock to GDP is 50% less around during COVID relative to non-crisis times, precisely because the kind of uncertainty that firms are facing is different. And I think one useful thing to note here is that if you look at the variance of output growth in the model and you compare this to the data, this simple, I think, both estimation procedure and informational assumption does a reasonably good job of accounting for this unconditional variance. The complete information model completely overshoots. And moreover, these changes in responsiveness are also important to account for the overall volatility of real GDP. Now, of course, what underlines the state dependence for aggregate shocks is the fact that, I think I'm running out of time. So I'll do 1 minute and then I'll conclude. Is the fact that these microeconomic sectoral shocks pass through in far different ways. So if you look at normal times versus COVID, donor weights are pretty good for approximating these Audi weights. But if you look at COVID, credit, say, which is an upstream sector, it's large, it has a high donor weight, a shock there would actually lead to a slight GDP contraction during COVID. And that's because we're dampening these higher order linkages that COVID faces by a large amount. And you can kind of see this here. These bubbles plot the overall level of firms' input responsiveness. It's hard for a shock that starts upstream to travel all the way downstream when firms aren't being very responsive to changes in their costs. Okay, so let me just conclude here. What I do in this paper is I study the interaction between incomplete information production networks. Sectoral importance, I think, is critically shaped by uncertainty, and there's a simple economic interpretation to how these shocks pass through into real GDP that's determined by this concept of alpha centrality that I explained. When there's a lot of productivity uncertainty, upstream importance. Demand uncertainty, it's downstream. And because uncertainty matters most during recessions, that's exactly when governments that would want to promote economic activity ought to take uncertainty into account. And I think there's a lot more stuff to be explored. So I'm very sorry for running over time. And thank you very much for your questions.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. Because we only have 2 presenters today, so we can be a little bit flexible in time. So I want to ask one final question. So
Yeah.
I believe your paper is very good, so it will be published at some top journals in the future. So what kind of extensions you can think about? So like in the future, what kind of like future work can be done along the direction of what that is set up by your paper?
Yeah, okay. So I think there's 2 ways. I think two useful ways for further exploration. I think the first one is to really take a stance at how firms respond to changes in their costs in the data. In fact, you don't really need this particular framework to study this, because as I showed you, firms' input responsiveness in this model is a sort of sufficient statistic for how these shocks affect real GDP. So if one could just use firm level or sectoral level data, which has firms' inputs at a disaggregated level and at reasonable high frequency, one could get, I think, at this really core statistic, which tells us how the shock should propagate and affect real GDP, a firm's input responsiveness.
Right.
I think this would be quite important, not because of this paper. Indeed, I think it would be more general. It would be important in disciplining a broad range of production network models, because it's essentially a sufficient statistic. Here, I've showed you one channel through which this input responsiveness can change, uncertainty, but in general, there might be other features that affect input responsiveness. So just even going to the data, measuring this, and then saying, you know, this is how I model it, this is how it might vary over time, I think would be an extremely useful exercise. And then, of course, I think just thinking about how things transact, what those transactions depend on. For example, there's also in the paper, I have a contracting sort of micro foundation for this particular informational structure. And I just think really thinking about how firms make production decisions and looking at these transactions, this unit at the micro level, seeing what it's contingent on, I think would also have important implications for business cycles broadly. So I think those two things I'm certainly interested in, and I think it might be useful to study in the future.
Okay, thank you so much for the response. So because we have recorded this video, so in the future we can see whether there will be more work to do along this.
I hope so.